So today, the WHO came out saying those who are asymptomatic carriers of COVID-19, so those who show no symptoms whatsoever, they feel as healthy as can be, are very unlikely to spread the disease. So we have been told this whole time that the reason we needed to shelter in place, the reason why healthy people needed to wear masks was because what if you were asymptomatic? What if you were a carrier who didn't know you had it? And then you went around and, you started giving it to people. And for that person, they were not as lucky. They unfortunately had extremely severe symptoms. So we were told this is why we needed to wear masks, even if we were feeling healthy. This is why we were told we needed to shelter in place, even if we were healthy. This is what was told to us in order to not just quarantine the sick, but to quarantine everybody. So watch this.
We hear from a number of countries that X percentage of them are reported as not having symptoms, or that they are in their pre-symptomatic phase, which means it's a few days before they actually develop severe symptoms. In a number of countries, when we go back and we discuss with them, one, how are these asymptomatic cases being identified? Many of them are being identified through contact tracing. And so, which is what we would want to see, in that you have a known case, you find your contacts, they're already in quarantine, hopefully, and some of them are tested, and then you pick up people who may have asymptomatic or no symptoms or even mild symptoms. The other thing we're finding is that when we actually go back and say how many of them were truly asymptomatic, we find out that many have really mild disease. Very mild disease. They're not quote-unquote COVID symptoms, meaning they may not have developed fever yet, they may not have had a significant cough, or they may not have shortness of breath, but some may have mild disease. Having said that, we do know that there can be people that are truly asymptomatic and PCR positive. The second part of your question is what proportion of asymptomatic individuals actually transmit? So the way that we look at that is we look at these individuals need to be followed carefully over the course of when they're detected and looking at secondary transmission. We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And that much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there's one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data, and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward. What we really want to be focused on is following the symptomatic cases. If we followed all of the symptomatic cases, because we know that this is a respiratory pathogen, it passes from an individual through infectious droplets. If we actually followed all of the symptomatic cases, isolated those cases, followed the contacts and quarantined those contacts, we would drastically reduce. I would love to be able to give a proportion of how much transmission we would actually stop, but it would be a drastic reduction in transmission. If we could focus on that, I think we would do very, very well in terms of suppressing transmission. But from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual.
So there it is. So the WHO says the way they came to this conclusion, now I know, with the WHO, it's been really hit or miss with a lot of their recommendations or things that they have said. But this is based on data that they've collected from all of these countries that have been doing extensive contact tracing. So this is not just the WHO saying something that they think, which is what was kind of going on in the very beginning of this pandemic. They were saying, oh, there can't be spread from person to person. They were saying all of these kind of things. But this is based on actual data. So even though there's reason to be skeptical of the WHO, with this particular information, it's really coming not from them, but from other nations. So some nations, not the United States, but some nations have been very good at contact tracing, very diligent with it. And what they found was that when they would find somebody who was asymptomatic, so the way they would find that person was somebody was showing up to be sick. They'd go to the hospital, they were sick. They would then do contact tracing. They would then go and test all of their contacts, even people who felt perfectly healthy. But what they found was people that felt perfectly healthy would sometimes test positive for COVID-19. and those people would never present with symptoms. They had the virus and the disease, and then they would recover, and they never felt a single symptom whatsoever. When they went and then did contact tracing for those asymptomatic people, they found it was very unlikely that they would spread it. It really just found that they weren't spreading it. So even though they say, yeah, it's possible for you to be asymptomatic and spread it, it's very, very unlikely. However, one caveat to this is there are some people who think they're asymptomatic, but they really are presenting some symptoms. So they just might not think those are the symptoms of COVID-19. This is where it gets tricky and where people need to be educated on what the actual symptoms are versus, and really they could be anything. So people who are feeling sick at all, there's a lot of people out there who, even in my own life, I would talk to a family member or a friend and they would say, oh, I'm a little sick, but it's not COVID-19. I don't have the symptoms for COVID-19. And that is where things get dangerous. If you're feeling sick at all, then you should be wearing a mask or you should be quarantining yourself because you don't really know what you have. But what they're saying is for the rest of us who feel perfectly healthy, who have no symptoms of any sickness, and who are just as healthy as can be, we're not likely, even if we're carrying it, to spread it. This is big news. This was what was told to us to sell all of us healthy people into quarantine. So if what the WHO is saying is accurate, I think our government leaders are going to have to take a real serious look at opening up as rapidly as possible when it comes to all these phases. We're doing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, all of these kind of phases. And here in California, the phases are absolutely ridiculous. We're entering phase 3 where as of this coming Friday, people are going to be able to go to bars, but they're still not going to be able to go to hair salons and nail salons. Explain how that makes any sense whatsoever. And it really doesn't make any sense. Especially when hair salons and nail salons, those people wear masks. Compared to bars, you can't drink a drink wearing a mask. So, a lot of the things that our government leaders are doing and recommending, or not even recommending, but forcing on us, are not making any sense. And they're not following actual science. They're not following the guidelines. And this is just going to be another showcasing. Now that the WHO came out with this, how much of this have you heard on the news? Is anybody talking about this? Or do they want to keep continuing to push the lockdown on us, even if the data is showing that healthy people are not spreading this virus, or even people who are asymptomatic? So now there are pre-symptomatic people who they're not symptomatic and then they become symptomatic. But again, it just doesn't look like in those stages you can spread the virus. Now a lot of people think you can only spread it if you have a fever. What they're saying is you need to be careful about that. If you're presenting any symptoms at all, you could be spreading this virus. So don't think it's certain symptoms that mean you have it and you can spread it. It's really just pay attention to any symptom of not feeling at your peak best. But if you're feeling at your peak best, if you feel healthy, it doesn't look like, even if you have it, you can spread it. This is pretty big news. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell. I've got more coming at you here in a moment.